format generally is I'm going to ask each of the panelists how they envision psychedelics could change the future and give them 7 minutes to answer. And I'm going to start with Gabor Mate.
As a medical doctor, I'm interested in the healing power, the healing potential in these substances. And I see that healing potential across the board. In other words, whether you're dealing with addictions, which is an area of interest of mine, or cancer, and I worked in palliative care for 7 years, or treatment of rheumatoid disorders, or any medical issue almost whatsoever. There's a reason why these substances can actually make a difference. Now, my work has been more specifically with ayahuasca. I have led and do lead retreats with the plant, and the work is really based on a very simple principle, which is that all the illness, whether we're talking about addiction, whether we're talking about the physical illnesses that I've just enumerated, are based not on simple biological factors, but the biology is actually shaped by people's life experience. And that life experience begins from the moment that we have life, and that means from the moment of conception. So that we know now that what happens in utero to people, the stresses on the mother, the stresses in the environment, have an impact on the physiology of the child and the child's brain, and particularly the birth process and the first 3 years of life shape a person's response to stress, shape a person's hormonal patterns. Julie mentioned in the film oxytocin, so oxytocin levels can be affected for a lifetime, endorphin, dopamine, serotonin levels can be affected for a lifetime, and how the person sees the world is affected for a lifetime. So that if there's a stressed or worse, traumatic environment, that person will perceive themselves as helpless, as powerless, they'll be anxious, they will not have confidence, they might perceive the world as hostile, or they might perceive the world as something they have to work very hard to make friendly to them. So in order to make the world friendly to them, they have to suppress themselves, who they really are, their real feelings, their genuine authentic aggression or anger. They have to be always concerned what other people think of them. These behavior patterns are actually stressful, and in my considered opinion, and in the light of a lot of research literature, they induce the illness. So whether we're looking at cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, or multiple sclerosis, we're actually looking at a lifetime of stress based on certain core beliefs that were acquired when we're helpless and unconscious in the womb and in the first few years of life. And then we act those out and stress ourselves, and that stress has an impact on our physiology. In the case of addiction, it's almost in every case based on severe childhood emotional loss or trauma. It's not a genetic issue, it's not a choice, it's something that happens in the brain because of early experience. So then, if these substances can do two things, one is to put us in touch with the emotional resonance of those early emotional experiences, the actual suffering that we endured, what we had to repress in order to survive, so we can see where our anxiety came from. So we can see where our belief that we have to be other than who we are, so that we can see that our patterns of self-soothing came from. Then we begin to have some agency over them. Number one. Number two, if these substances, as in the case of ayahuasca and other substances, can put us in touch with the authentic self that is actually underlies and is covered by that false self that we discovered, then we can have an insight that who we are is not our behavior all our lives. It's not the patterns that we've adopted as a survival mechanism. It's not the anxiety. It's not the depression. It's not the self-loathing that we developed as children, but that there's a true authentic self that is actually free, that is loving. I mean, the first time I did ayahuasca, I just had tears of love rolling down my face. And it wasn't love for any one person, it was just love. And I know that personally in my own life, I've seriously and repeatedly shut myself off from love, defended myself against it, because when I was an infant, my love caused me pain because of my circumstances. So that shutdown against love is a defense, the love of myself, the love of others. So this plant dissolved those egoic defenses, and I was able to see and experience the true experience of love that is actually me. Now that's very liberating if, and here's where the warning comes in. How much time do I got? 2 minutes. Gotta be conscious of the time. Here's 4 books and a lifetime experience in 7 minutes. Here's the, and I've totally interrupted myself, I have no idea what I was going to say. This is ADD in action. Oh yeah, the warning. Here's the warning. As somebody in the film very astutely said, these experiences open a door, but they're not it. So people can come to these retreats and have experiences, have beautiful insight, understand the trauma, know who they are, fully experience who they are, but it takes practice afterwards, because as the Buddha said, we have these habit energies that flood in afterwards and they take over, because those channels have been grooved very, very deeply throughout our life. So because we have one of these experiences or two, does not mean that we're transformed. Transformation for most of us is much tougher than that. Transformation takes work, it takes attention, it takes awareness, it takes commitment. But if we can combine these insights and those doors that are open with behavior that will make us walk through those doors, then these experiences can indeed be potential inducements and catalysts for healing. I will just mention that those of you that are interested in addiction and my particular perspective on that, I will be speaking in New York on Monday night at the Open Center on Addictions. The information is on my website. But to sum it up then, both in my personal experience and in the clinical experience of people that I've worked with, these substances have enormous potential when used properly, not recreationally, but in the right context, with the right leadership, the right guidance, and the right intention. Thank you.
Next is Julie Holand, also a psychiatrist and author of 2 books, at least 2 books, several books, but 2 books specifically about the medicinal use of psychedelic drugs, cannabis, and MDMA. How do you think that psychedelics could change your medical practice in the future?
Right now in psychiatry, it's really all about sort of sweeping the symptoms under the rug. I mean, you've got symptoms and you can take medicine that'll make the symptoms go away, but they don't really make the disease go away, they don't make the problems go away, and they don't really make the psychic pain go away. And it would be very helpful to my field to have some medicines that, instead of sort of numbing you, making you not care, made you really look at yourself and get more in touch, more meaning, not less, going deeper, not being more superficial. And I think with psychedelics, a lot of the medicines that are in this film they're really drugs that don't take the edge off and make you go away. They make you go in more deeply, and they make you feel things more profoundly, and they make you feel more connected to yourself, to other people, to all of humanity. And I think that most of the medicines that we have in psychiatry really do the opposite. They make you feel a little bit less yourself and less connected. And they're soothers, they're sort of psychic pain relievers. But to me, the goal is not to sweep the dirt under the rug. It's to take the rug out back and slam the hell out of it and really clean your house. And I don't think that a lot of medicines in psychiatry are really effective house cleaners. There's my analogy. So, when I have to correct you a little bit. I'm not the author. I'm the editor of 2 nonprofit projects. One is on MDMA, called Ecstasy: The Complete Guide. Then I was supposed to call it Molly. And the other is called The Pot Book: A Complete Guide to Cannabis. And both of these are nonprofit projects that fund clinical research. So I'm the medical monitor for several studies, the MDMA PTSD studies, and also a study we're trying to get off the ground, which is using cannabis to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'm particularly interested in MDMA and cannabis and how they could be used in psychiatry to help people. I mean, I have a lot of patients who really get some benefit from cannabis, whether it's to help them with their insomnia or their depression or their anxiety. And here there's a big difference between THC and CBD, cannabidiol, in terms of what it can do for treating psychiatric symptoms. You know, THC can sometimes make you more anxious or more paranoid, but CBD can often make you less anxious and less paranoid. So it's important to me that people understand CBD, cannabidiol, and learn more about it and talk more about it, because I think it has tremendous potential to be useful in psychiatry. And there's no question that MDMA could be very useful in psychiatry. I mean, you couldn't design a better medicine as a catalyst for psychotherapy. I mean, this is something that helps people to be a little bit less defended and less anxious about going to the places where they need to go to in order to get well. I mean, I almost often describe MDMA psychotherapy as like, it's a little bit like anesthesia with surgery, where the person's so much more open and comfortable, you can really kind of get to that painful, malignant place that needs to be pulled out and examined in order for somebody to get better. And I'm sure Rick is going to talk more about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy research. So, the only thing I really want to also mention is this sort of harm reduction message now with MDMA, with ecstasy or Molly, that there's a lot of drug substitution, and there's basically what's happening now is that there's really an increased demand and decreased supply, and so there's a lot of research chemicals and other things available in white powders of people who would like to have an MDMA experience but are getting a lot of other things they weren't necessarily bargaining for. So I always like to mention the risk of hypothermia and overhydration. People shouldn't drink too much water. And what's nice about the medical model with MDMA is that they know they're taking MDMA, and they know how much they're taking, and they're not dancing for hours without taking a break, and they're not drinking too much water. And so that's why, you know, this is an FDA-sanctioned study, because FDA agrees that there really may be benefits that easily outweigh the risks in a medical setting. And it would really be nice to have this tool available. You know, this, as I said, it's a non-sedating anxiolytic. This is something that markedly decreases anxiety but doesn't sedate you. Very useful for psychotherapy, helps you can process your traumas more fully, and also feel very connected with your therapist. So because of the oxytocin, you feel very trusting and bonded with your therapist, and that therapeutic alliance, which really matters in psychotherapy, that carries over even without the drug, so you can continue to get good work done. I think psychedelics really are tools in the way that, you know, microscopes or telescopes are tools, and I think that they can point you where you need to look, and you can take a big bite off, but then you have to spend some time sort of chewing and processing, and yeah, the door is open, but you need to sort of go into the rooms and look around and work with what you find. So you definitely need psychotherapy without the psychedelics afterwards to process what you've learned. That's all I got.
Next is Joan Narby, anthropologist and author of The Cosmic Serpent.
Yes, hi. Okay. Well, I've been asked to address the question, in a perfect world, how would indigenous ethnobotanical knowledge be integrated into Western society? So here's my 7 minutes on that. In a perfect world, there would be lots of imperfection. Flaws and failed experiments are essential to learning and knowledge. Perfection is not human. I wish to see a human future, not a perfect one. Many indigenous societies use the word human to refer to plants and animals, because they say plants and animals are just like us. They're intelligent, they perceive, they communicate, they're members of our family. In the Amazon, for example, people there view plants like ayahuasca, tobacco, and coca as teachers. And working with plants as teachers is like going to school. It's something you do seriously. Over time, you go through certain procedures, and then you learn things about yourself and the world around you. And the plant specialist, the tabaquero or the ayahuasquero or the shaman, acts like a guide, and it takes you to the plant but the learning that you do comes from the plant itself. Well, learning from a plant was not something that I could initially understand. It wasn't part of my culture or my education. It's something that you understand through practice, ingesting a psychoactive plant, and then learning to develop a relationship with it, and allowing it to inspire your mind, learning to see it like an ally that you consult. Humans have long viewed psychoactive plants as teachers that can enhance healing and learning and thinking. But working with these powerful plants is tricky, and it takes know-how. They have a shadow side. They take time to get to know, and approaching them casually is inappropriate. In an ideal world, people wishing to work with these plants could use the services of indigenous healers, but in an equitable exchange. That's one of the problems with a lot of current ayahuasca tourism, is that it increases local inequalities because it concentrates money in the hands of individual shamans. And in countries where most people are poor, suddenly making one person rich can make things worse rather than better. A reciprocal exchange would involve setting up indigenous universities where citizens of the world could go and study Ashaninka tobacco use, or Shipibo ayahuasca use, or how to diet, or Icaros 101 chanting. And, there would be courses on the hygiene of power, or the importance of ritual, or avoiding the dark side, or feline transformation. The different indigenous traditions would be able to make themselves available. Indigenous organizations would choose the materials taught and would choose the instructors. There would be less emphasis on individual shamans. There would be shamanic standards. There would be less incompetent and crooked ayahuasqueros. In this ideal world, there would be international research institutes with Yankee doctors, Chinese doctors, Ayurvedic doctors, and Amazonian doctors doing research together on medicinal plants. And they would have a common language that would reconcile, control, and respect microscopes and modified states of consciousness, scientific texts and oral expertise, matter and spirit, detachment and emotion. In an ideal world, people would be free to learn from plants. My experience with plant mixtures like ayahuasca or psilocybin mushrooms is that they show you first and foremost your own presuppositions. They show you your gaze on the world. It's like taking off your glasses and looking at them. It can be discombobulating, but instructive. I think it's an experience that any adult in the world should be able to have. But that said, it's not everybody's cup of tea, and it will probably remain a minority sport. In an ideal world, people who would work with these plants would refer to the oldest cultures of usage. It's like with wine culture. All eyes turn to France. The French have an interesting concept when it comes to consuming wine, which is le savoir boire, the know how to drink. You do not drink wine for breakfast. You do drink wine with family and friends with a meal. You do not chug it down. You learn to savor it. It has become part of culture. Now in contemporary society, we're seeing the return of coffee culture in coffee shops and coffee houses, where people pay attention to the aromas and the conditions of growth, and they get to hang out with like-minded people in comfortable circumstances. Well, why not have the same for coca leaves and make cocaine and Coca-Cola less attractive to people, and simply treat coca leaves like coffee and tobacco. Of course, there would be an Andean coca university that would teach know how to chew courses. For Andean people, coca is the mother of thought, and to chew coca is to think well. They ritualize the experience, and they treat the plant with respect and like a living being, not just like some stuff that you chew on to get a buzz from. In an ideal world, people would treat plants as persons, treat them with respect, and say thank you to them. Thank you.
Next is Rick Doblin, founder of MAPS, an organization I'm sure many of you are familiar with. He has already done an enormous amount towards making psychedelics part of conventional medicine. But what do you predict will happen in the future, and what would you do to change the practice of medicine in the future?
Well, what I predict will happen in the future is we're now calling, in terms of our drug development plan, for MDMA to be made into a prescription medicine in 2021. It's remotely possible that it could happen quicker. We're now engaged in discussions with the Veterans Administration, with the Department of Defense, about the work with veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder from Iraq and Afghanistan. And also, we've done some work with Vietnam War vets. And so what we're able to show is that people who have had trauma for decades, frozen in place as if it's still happening, that under certain circumstances that they're able to make a dramatic transformation, and then with the proper integration work after, they're able to really change their lives. So I think if we are able to move into this work in association with the military, then we're going to make a little bit more rapid progress. But right now, the veterans that we're working with are all coming to us from outside of the VA system. And we're working politically with Senator Jay Rockefeller, who was on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, who's written letters to the Department of Defense and to the VA about moving forward with MDMA PTSD research. And then we're working with veterans from the bottom up to try to make this more politically palatable. And right now, there's about 23 veterans every day that commit suicide, and one active duty soldier. And so there's this incredible sense of need for something new. And last year, the Veterans Administration spent $5.5 billion just on disability payments to around 275,000 veterans. That's an annual cost of war in the past wars, and it's increasing. So there's a culture in crisis. There's drugs that are coming to help out drug-assisted psychotherapy, but these are demonized drugs. And so what we're trying to do is shift this balance. And I think we're making a lot of progress. As you can see from the movie, as you can see from just the way that the research is moving forward, that we are changing attitudes. And I think a lot of it is following from some of the examples of medical marijuana. And there's been some recent polling that has looked at why people vote for legalizing marijuana. And you would think that the most important indicator for whether somebody is in favor of legalizing marijuana is whether they smoke marijuana themselves. But that's not the case. The most important factor is whether somebody knows a medical marijuana patient. And I think that's because we have so much information that floods us from the media. It's hard for people to tell what's true and what's not, even with good, unbiased science. One day you hear, something is good for you, the next day there's another study that repudiates it and says it's bad for you. It's hard to know, but when we get word of mouth from somebody that we are close with and hear that something was helpful to them, that changes our attitudes and that changes our estimate of risk and benefit. But I want to make a strategic point, which is, first off, Albert Einstein said that the splitting of the atom has changed everything except for our mode of thinking, and hence we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. What shall be required if mankind is to survive is a whole new mode of thinking. And so what I believe this mode of thinking is this idea that we're all one, and that we break down these different barriers, and then we can move forward. Robert Mueller, who was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, wrote this book in the early 80s called New Genesis, Shaping of Global Spirituality. And his view was that we have the United Nations to mediate conflicts between countries, but that underneath a lot of those conflicts are religious-based conflicts, and so that we need a united religions and sort of a global spirituality. And I contacted him and said, I really agree with what you said, but you didn't mention anything in your book about psychedelics. And here they can really be tools for promoting this mystical experience. And I told him about the Good Friday experiment. And I was a college undergraduate, and he wrote me back, first off, shockingly, and then he gave me a list of people to contact in the religious professions. The subtext was, send an MDMA, which I proceeded to do. Then they used it in monasteries and Zen meditation retreats, in various ordination of rabbis and various different ceremonies, and reported back to him. So I think the integration of psychedelics into culture is something that goes way beyond medical uses. And I think it's essential, really, for us to be able to feel on a personal level and then culturally the sense that we're all one, and be able to really work on the problems that we have together. But I think strategically, and I shifted from trying to become a clinical psychologist to do psychedelic research to studying the politics of the drug war and the politics of medical research. And so I went to the Kennedy School of Government and have my master's and PhD from there. And so strategically, what I think we've come around to see is that the medical use of these drugs is one of the most important doorways into the culture. Our culture is so, as Dennis McKenna said, the culture wants you to use drugs. They just want you to use the pharmaceutical companies' drugs. So if we can pharmaceuticalize the psychedelics and medical marijuana, I think we will change people's attitudes in a tremendous way. And I think the religious freedom arguments are even deeper and more important, but I think they're harder to make, because what we are talking about really with this religious freedom is that it's a freedom from religion as well. People should have their own individual access to these substances, to their apprehension of the divine. It doesn't necessarily require a religion, just a spiritual attitude and a supportive context. And yet the religious freedom laws that we have focus on group religions. So I think we need to move forward on religious freedom a lot, but that at the same time, I think the doorway is more open for medicalization. But we need to realize that it's only a partial step forward, and that we need to talk. And that's why, for me, what's been really difficult is that I believe that in the celebratory, recreational aspects of this, that people use these things at festivals with the group rituals, that they're transformative. There's some reason why kids are going to these festivals and making some serious risks in terms of getting drugs that they don't know what they are, because this is something that the culture is really hungry for. So I think that the medicalization is something that will require, we guess, around $20 million and about 8 more years. And that's for MDMA for PTSD. We're starting studies with MDMA for social anxiety in autistic adults. We're talking about OCD and MDMA, end of life anxiety. We're talking about starting a study with MDMA for that. And the incredible work with psilocybin with end of life. So all of these are really changing culture, but I do think that we need to think about drug policy as a whole, which also needs to be reformed, and then developing a more spiritualized world. And we're not able at this point to get government funding. We're not able to get major foundations. I just was with someone who was with the MacArthur Foundation, and he told me that there is no way that they will ever fund anything that we're doing. And you think the MacArthur Foundation is pretty open-minded and pretty progressive, but even for them. So it falls on us. It falls on those individuals and small family foundations or large family foundations to support this work and develop sort of nonprofits that are engines that have products to sell, and then from those sales that we become the pharmaceutical companies, we reinvest in more research. So I think really we're at a very good place in the culture right now. It may take another couple of years for us to be formally cooperating with the military, but the veterans, the firefighters, the first responders who we're working with are considered by the culture are highly valued members. And that's where we're breaking down the us and them barriers. So all of the medical and scientific research is also politically selected. And I think there's a very good chance that in the next 10, 15 years, we will see psychedelic medicine, psychedelic clinics, and then a growing sense that marijuana will be legal, and so will all these psychedelics for the broader range of uses. Thank you.
This is Jag Davies. You are the Public Relations Director for the Drug Policy Alliance. So based on everything you've heard thus far, what are some practical steps that could be taken in terms of drug policy to implement these changes?
Okay, thank you. Well, I come to this issue not as a doctor or as a scientist, but as a political advocate concerned about human rights and civil rights. And it just so happens that the system of drug prohibition and drug criminalization, better known as the war on drugs, is the greatest human rights catastrophe in the United States over the past generation. There have been 45 million Americans arrested for nothing more than possessing or producing drugs since President Nixon declared the war on drugs 40 years ago. And still, there's about 500,000 people behind bars on any given night for nothing more than a nonviolent drug law violation. So I think there's a lot that people can do on a very micro level, at the local level. Obviously there's been incredible progress in terms of working within the medical system and working within the legal system to carve out exceptions for people to use psychedelic drugs in various contexts that aren't criminalized. But there's a lot more opportunities. It's harder to change policy at a national level and at an international level. And so I think where people can have the most impact is in their everyday lives at the local level, getting involved in the PTA at your kids' school and demanding that they implement a better drug education program than the stupid DARE program. Going to your local city council meetings, barely anyone shows up, they'll listen to you. Going to your local police department and working with them and letting them know that you as a resident of the neighborhood would prefer that they prioritize their resources in a way that actually enhances public health and public safety. Just in New York City alone, here, as probably a lot of you are aware, New York City has the largest amount of marijuana possession arrests of any city in the world. About 50,000 people are arrested every year for nothing more than possessing a small amount of marijuana in New York City, which obviously greatly impacts their lives. Even if you don't spend a long time in jail, that criminal record shows up every time you go to apply for a job, every time you go to apply for an apartment, every time you go to apply for a loan, when you go to apply for school. So the system of drug criminalization that we have has perpetuated a lot of the class and racial inequalities. I should mention also, of those 50,000 marijuana arrests, very, very few of them look like the people in this audience. It's almost entirely young men between 18 and 25 who are Black and Latino. And so I think even though perhaps we're only being indirectly affected by the drug war, probably most of the people in the audience have been able to use the drugs of their choice without ending up in the criminal justice system. If we really take to heart the message in the film that that we're all connected. Look on your street corner. Look at the police stopping and frisking all the young men that are going by, and get involved at the smallest level, at the most direct local level that you can. And I think that's also the most personally rewarding as well. Not only is it the most impactful because you can actually see the difference that you're making. I guess the sort of larger, more abstract hope that I have is that society can, and that all of us here can really fully embrace the idea that no one should be punished solely for what they put into their own bodies, absent harm to others. There's a real tendency that we have. It's very easy to fall into the dualistic notion of that there's good drugs and that there's bad drugs. And I think what we all know from studying psychedelics is that there's no such thing as a good drug or a bad drug. It depends on the setting, and just as the government and all these vested interests have propagated a lot of myths about psychedelics, that's also true with other drugs as well. The criminalization of any drugs is not based on science or any sort of rational public policy analysis. It's based on politics and the people that are associated with those drugs. So I would hope that, something I would encourage people to do is learn about a drug that you think is really bad. Or try it even. But learn about it, and you probably will find that a lot of the assumptions that you have that there's more to it than that. The federal government's own research shows that about 90% of people who try any illegal drug, even ones that are more dangerous, like methamphetamine or heroin, still the vast majority of people that try them do so without becoming addicted or without experiencing problems. So, we need to put this into practice more broadly. And hopefully that would lead to drug policies that are more grounded in science and compassion and human rights.
Lastly, there is Roy Haber, a civil rights lawyer who successfully defeated the DEA's attempts to prevent the Santo Daime Church from using ayahuasca as a sacrament. From your perspective, what changes could be put in place legally to advance? What changes could be put in place legally to advance the use of psychedelics as medicine and as sacraments?
The first thing that dawns on me is it just seems so obvious that the Great Spirit God, the Creator, put these spirit plants on the planet to assist us in having a connection with and understanding our relationship to the divine. And that just seems clear. We here tonight are actually part of the co-creation of this. All of the lovely people here who've journeyed, we are here as one. And that is promoting these interests. Having said that, I can't see the DEA agents from here because the light's in my eyes. But I wanted them to know that I am their worst nightmare. Does anybody know why? Because I'm what Nixon was talking about. I'm a smart Jewish lawyer, and this is my weapon. All right, so I've only got a few minutes. Let me start with this. My job is to get past all of the illusory justifications that the DEA has used to persecute the use of entheogens. That's my job. I bring together religion, law, and science. All right? And so this is very interesting. Our Supreme Court held several years ago as follows. This is just amazes me every time I read it. Nature, science, and God seem so close to oneness with a capital O that some thinkers blend them inseparably. Our Supreme Court acknowledges that science and religion are inseparable, the more we learn about it. Now, why is it this way? Why are these substances outlawed? And I want to read to you from Michael Winkelmann, who you saw in this movie several times, and Luis Luna, both of whom are experts that I use. This is the genesis of these laws. Talking about the Inquisition when it moved into Peru and Brazil, they write, the invaders readily understood the religious connotation of the use of these plants. From the very onset, it was violently persecuted by the religious authorities of the conquerors, which considered these plants to be a vehicle of contact with the devil, a crime equated with cannibalism and severely punished by the Inquisition. That is the genesis, the fear of the Christian Catholic Church that the devil is at work. Richard Wolff, who some of you know has been a supporter of our work over the years, he wrote, strangely enough, the Spanish Inquisition is still with us in form. But instead of the churches having their own police, our governments now do this job for them. Church doctrine is now enforced by the criminal laws. And that's where we are, and that's the basis for the Controlled Substances Act. Now, when it was passed in 1974, there had been no studies on any of these substances. Testifying before Congress was a man by the name of Dr. Hollister, who was the chief psychiatrist for the Veterans Administration and considered at that time one of the experts on drugs. He wrote, I can find no colleagues who will state that the scheduling of these drugs makes any sense. Nor can I find anyone who was consulted about the proposed scheduling. This scheduling, which groups together such drugs as diverse as heroin, marijuana, and LSD, perpetuates a fallacy long apparent to our youth. These drugs are not equivalent in pharmacological effect or danger to individuals or societies. So how did these laws stand up under scrutiny? The answer to that is when Congress passes the laws, it doesn't require the Congress to establish that they're rational. Unless, in doing so, they violate constitutional right. Now, these plant substances, they've been used by religions for thousands of years, and so they're entitled to protection. Yet our Supreme Court in 1990 held that, if I can find it here, that religion will no longer be a reason to violate the law. As a result of that terrible, terrible decision, Congress passed what's known as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And that brought back the requirement that the government establish not just that this is a criminal violation, but that there's a compelling interest in the particular situation to prosecute, to ban, to take away the entheogen. Now, in 1999, I represented the Santa Diamond Church. This is a church that evolved in the Amazon, and it was a Christian church, and instead of the wine being the Eucharist, ayahuasca was considered the Eucharist. And this church expanded in Brazil into the United States, and there was an arrest. And by the way, everything I'm going to say about ayahuasca here, I believe is equally applicable to the other plants, the other teacher plants. And so the DEA arrested the leaders, and I filed a suit in federal court. And the government claimed that it had a compelling interest to keep this 100-person church from existing because it had such a compelling interest that permitting the use of the tea for this group would be a terrible public health risk. Essentially, they were saying people are going to be dead on the streets, and they're going to go crazy, and we're going to have chaos. But the government was put into a position for the first time ever of having to justify its conclusions. And the government hired 8 scientists, I hate to use the word hooker, But these were people who were paid an enormous amount of money. The government spent $10 million on this case. And the testimony of these hired experts was that the tea may cause psychosis. The tea may cause pregnant women to abort. The tea may do A, B, C, D, and E. And the risks associated with taking the tea should not be permitted unless and until there's further study. And that we, the plaintiffs, have to establish that there are no dangers associated with use of the tea. What's wrong with that construct? It's not our burden. Once you've established a religion, the burden shifts to the government to establish beyond a doubt that it's actually dangerous. There was no data whatsoever to support these conclusions. The only testimony was from our experts that the studies that have been done establish there's no short or long-term ill health effects associated with taking the tea. This is the first time in the history of this country where the DEA was really put to the task of defending the illusory justifications for the Controlled Substances Act. The judge found that because there was a lack of data to support the risk is a meaningless concept unless you look at risk as a function of data, of how much it takes, because any substance can be dangerous. Judge Panner, for the first time in the history of this country, issued a finding that the government's experts' conclusions were all based upon speculation. Now this is a huge crack. They were never put to this task before, and now we have a federal court that has made a finding that the DEA has no basis for saying that the ayahuasca tea is dangerous for health, or that it's going to become a recreational drug. There's been enough discussion, you all know it's not recreational. And so now we are looking at what's next. And I represented the Santa Daime, and now I have another ayahuasquero who has a very legitimate history, who comes from a long line of ayahuasqueros, who fits into the context of the type of person who is a religious leader. And I know that Rick spoke about it would be great to be able to have us all create our own religion, but that's not the law right now. Hopefully one day Rick will get there. But right now, I'm giving you folks a very positive thing to look forward to here. And that is that we will continue to take apart the DEA because they don't do studies, because they know the studies are going to be in your favor. So my recommendation to everybody, my one recommendation is, I feel like my heart and soul are in this. And it does create great anxiety for me to hear about all of the so-called ayahuasqueros who are delivering tea. And I urge everybody here to be really circumspect about who you do it with, how you do it, where you do it. Because the wrong person with the wrong ayahuasquero, where something happens, is going to make my work really hard. My work is your work.